So welcome everybody. My name is Ben Hamlin. I am in the Quality Measurement and Research Group at the National Committee for Quality Assurance, which is a mouthful. I've been an Odyssey watcher for a long time. I'd love to say collaborator, but NCQA is not a massive data holder. And so really my world has been trying to look at the intersection of the quality phenotypic world or the quality world and the Odyssey and the possibilities that exist. And this work primarily came out of the OMOP FHIR work group. That was started sort of when HL7 and Odyssey developed a collaborative agreement to sort of work together to try and understand how these standards could work together. And I'm going to be presenting to you today a quality use case to try and help understand how that might actually happen in the real world. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So really and truly, this is not we want everyone to do everything on FHIR. We want everything to do everything on OMOP. What we're really looking to do is to try and leverage the best of both worlds. Digital quality measures are specified primarily using the HL7 standards, but all the really good stuff that we need to do to validate all those algorithms and everything is essentially in the OMOP Odyssey world. And so how do we find a solution to really enable taking those static definitions, those objective, well-defined cohorts that we use for our quality measures, but also now are being used for other things like disease surveillance and other sort of extensions, some of which I'm a little uncomfortable with because I don't have the level of information around those. But again, we really want the most reliable, valid, and scientifically sound definition for our quality measures. And so how can we leverage what the options that are very familiar to you all? And I apologize, some of this may be very basic, but this is a presentation that sort of is supposed to speak to both the HL7 and the Odyssey communities. And so what we're really trying to propose is that we are looking to transform the FHIR CQL digital quality measure or dQM representations to an OMOP CQL representation in order to unlock that large-scale analytical power that's provided by OMOP and Odyssey community and all the tools available there. Really, a sort of a seamless interoperability of both FHIR and OMOP would really leverage the strengths again of both standards and would allow us to really efficiently and effectively perform these validations for quality measure definitions. You can go to the next slide for me. So quality measurement in the national level has been around for a long time. HEDIS has been in place for almost 35 years. Unfortunately, some of the existing measures that are still high priority in a lot of programs were developed almost 30 years ago based on data that was available at that time and sort of this idea of how burdensome quality measurement was. It was not digital. Our new digital ecosystem really looks to solve a lot of those problems in the terms of being able to really become more patient-focused or person-focused, allow us to be less retrospective and more sort of decision supportive. And so really what these new dQMs we're developing are much more complex, but because they require a lot more specific data, but also a larger volume of data, again, because we're really removing the manual processes required. But what that means is these new measures really can, in theory at least, this is still proof of concept in some cases, can produce and they can deliver relevant information to the right place in a usable format when it's most useful to inform decision making. And so that's the goal of what we try and do in the quality measurement realm. Next slide, please. Before I go too much into that, I kind of have to back up a little bit and explain what digital quality measures really are. Digital quality measures are obviously quality measures that are specified or written using interoperability standards. And that includes the standards both for the CDM, but also for the logical models we use to help associate all these relevant components. They're a self-contained package that has both ELM files and human readable information in them, which allows implementers to, instead of the traditional model where they would have to sort of read a narrative, interpret that, write some code, try it in their own native data sets, and then try and produce some results that were kind of what we expected. We're producing all that code highly standardized using highly standardized models, and we're validating that code before we publish it, such that essentially these organizations can just build engines to consume that, run it on their standard data, and then produce highly reliable results in a very efficient manner. So this is how we get to this being able to be less retrospective and more able to sort of produce relevant information when it's useful. But again, the traditional model was very manual. It required almost 9 people to sort of document the data, extract that data at a later time, write some code to find that data, to calculate the result, someone to interpret all that information, then present that in a report that was standardized enough that the person who was at the end user could actually understand it. So these seemingly straightforward things like, did you have a screening once a year become really, really complicated when you implement them because, again, the data's all over the place. The people have different levels of expectation. It's all kind of happening after the fact, so you're sometimes having to fill some gaps and so on and so forth. So in digital measurement, however, we've done a couple things. So we've, again, used standard data models, interoperability data models. Right now, FHIR is the one we're using primarily for HEDIS, at least. But we also provide all the computable measure logic around that. So the measures define each element. They refer to any values in a very static and standard way that would infer any kind of clinically meaningful value, but also any kind of clinical reasoning around those values and those terminologies that allow us to calculate a valid, reliable measure result. And so this reduces essentially the number of people in the quality measurement value chain down to the patient and the person interpreting this information and helping make that patient decisions about their healthcare. So, in the ideal world, this sort of takes all that burden of the data processing out of the hands of the people, because that's highly inefficient, and the volumes of data that people are expected to use for quality measure reporting is just it's too much for any even set of humans to abstract in a reasonably efficient and useful manner. So next slide, please. And I'm sorry I'm going through this very quickly, but I want to just kind of cover a lot of territory, and you can ask questions later or pick on any specific points. Rule-based cohort definitions are the most common structure for denominators and numerators in digital quality measures. So our inclusion criteria is predefined based on data source and type, and these are all tested and validated before we publish these things. So I tend to use the term cohort definition to describe the measured denominator, for example. When I'm talking about the testing these characteristics in real world data, I tend to refer those as phenotypes. And that's just sort of my own preferential thing, but if I use those terms interchangeably, they really are synonymous. So the measured denominator is a rule-based static definition, cohort definition for inclusion and theoretically exclusion criteria, but the measures don't really write them that way. I'll get to that in a little bit. But what we're really talking about is, is a phenotype in the real world. How do you execute that phenotype against real world data to make sure that either the person or the group of people that you want to do something with are defined in a standardized manner? Next slide, please.
Ben, can I ask you a quick question while you're on that?
Sure.
And maybe this is too far in the weeds, but I just want to confirm for myself. When we, in the Odyssey community, when we talk about phenotypes and cohort definitions, we talk about the set of people that satisfy the criteria. So quite literally, we're talking about, the cohort table, and it's a row per, person ID, start date, and end date. In your context, do you actually want the data set to have the persons, be the person ID, start date, end date, or in truth, do you just want the count of persons? Meaning that the quality measure itself is usually a denominator statistic, which is a count of persons, and a numerator statistic, which is the count of persons. Are you is your aim the numerator and denominator, or is actually the aim a data set of persons that the count of those is the answer?
The former. So the measure only really relies on the count of persons in each cohort, the numerator and denominator. When we're testing and validating those definitions, however, we do want to go a little deeper to really understand sort of who's in, who's out, what's the variability of identification in different data sets. So it's kind of a two-level thing, but really right now, mostly what we're concerned about is a count of a person, a count of persons in a denominator, and then what proportion of that count of persons also meets the numerator criterion. Is that
Yep, that's very helpful.
useful?
Thank you.
Okay.
May I ask also, if you're using FHIR resources to represent that data, what FHIR resources you're using?
Well, that is a difficult question because we're using a lot of them. I mean, it's really measure dependent, depending on, there's an entire HEDIS core now, implementation guide that details all the different constraints on the FHIR resources for each individual measure that we use in HEDIS right now. And that's actually getting expanded out now because we've now just digitalized the entire HEDIS portfolio, or at least 78% of it. Yeah, so there's a lot of resources being used. US core is one of the references beat, but again, there's further constraints on that. and that's defined in HEDIS core in terms of the resources used and also the specific extensions or other things we need to do the measures.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it gets very complicated very quickly. So back to sort of why we're talking about, looking at OMOP as the solution to this issue that measure developers have in terms of validating these very specific definitions that we use. Our algorithms used to assign persons to these cohorts really have to be updated on a regular basis. I mean, in theory, we say every 3 years these measure algorithms get updated. Well, that is 3 years is kind of a guidepost for when we should be reevaluating these things, but also this idea that the volume of data and the types of data that are now available in these integrated data sets is expanding much faster than 3 years, and we really need to kind of keep the measure definitions up to date with those at the extent possible. But unfortunately, it's really hard to do that because again, I don't have data at NCQA. The payers don't submit all their healthcare information to me, and then I calculate the measures. We sort of do this again where we get cohort counts as a measure report from them each year, and then that's validated by auditors separately. So we really want to make sure that our measure definitions are maintaining our high expectation for sensitivity and specificity to ensure that our measure reports have validity and are reliable and maintain our level of scientific soundness that we've initially specified them for, and they meet the clinical guideline specification. And the OMOP CDM is perfect for this. I mean, it really creates efficient analyses and more reliable evidence to support the quality measures because it's organized to do this large-scale distributed data analytics, where FHIR is really more focused on operational needs of healthcare providers and sort of structural, administrative, and other financial personnel aspects of healthcare data. And so while we've chosen the FHIR specification to define our measures in, that's to sort of help with the end game of extracting that information from these administrative and financial and other sort of operational clinical data sets, theoretically, that the measures could run against. But it doesn't help with the validation of those because it's just not organized that way. So next slide, please. And so this kind of gives you a window into my world where, $500,000 per measure developed is actually pretty conservative estimate. I mean, to develop a measure for HEDIS, we're looking at 3 years and probably 1.2 million. But then again, that's only for development initial release. We reevaluate that measure on an ongoing basis. And so the maintenance costs of that, they just accelerate massively. The CMS ECQMs that were derived from those measures, again, there's thousands of measures. A lot of them tend to be the same flavor of different flavors of the same concepts in most cases. But again, there's once CMS publishes an e-measure, it's not reevaluated. So they just publish and expect people to report those back. And so there's really no way to systematically evaluate these measures in real world data to make sure that we're still measuring what we intend to be measuring as the data keeps changing and expanding and doing different things. And again, so I just want to kind of give you an idea of why we think this concept is so important to really leverage the Odyssey tools and this environment to do this kind of work. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of what we're hoping to accomplish. Now, this is all still very formative. And again, like we said, there's the dQM schemas are a little different from how things are defined in Odyssey or in OMOP. So, for example, we sort of start with initial population, we remove some people from that, and then we eventually get a denominator usually, but there's also other rules that apply. So we have to first sort of piece together the logical expressions that are FHIR CQL defined before we start the conversion to make sure that we're actually getting that cohort denominator we want. We also, our value sets in FHIR are referenced via an API terminology service, which we would then need to convert to, concept sets for OMOP. And again, these are things that kind of have to happen manually now, but we're going to be starting with this manually with the idea of defining the architecture to do this and then being able to automate a lot of these processes at some point in the future to really help us, accelerate this to do it for hundreds of measures. Our DQL, I sort of alluded to this fact, our DQL expressions use CQL, which is data model independent. It's our logic model for tying together all the pieces of the measure. Its libraries reference the various, components and defined statements that we do, to how our measures are sort of, our measure references and our terminologies and so on and so forth, all its values we need. So it's a really great domain agnostic standard for the logical model for doing these kind of definitions. It also produces a human readable output. So in the quality world, that's really important because the majority of the quality world are not software engineers or they're not coders. And so they don't understand how to read JSON or XML, which are the primary ELMs that we produce for digital quality measures. They look at that and they just say, nah, forget it. So this human readable component of CQL really helps us with the deployment of these measures because we can explain. I don't have to then interpret the ELM files for the quality engineer, the quality improvement specialists, or the quality people in the health plans. I can sort of show them the logic written out as human readable. I mean, it's not human readable to everybody. There's a sort of a literacy component you need to do, but again, it is fairly human readable. So again, this is why we like CQL, and Clark will talk a little bit more about CQL. So I'm going to leave the specifics about that to him because he can speak to it much better than I can. But anyway, so being able to define these concepts and then moving around into executing them in the Odyssey environment provides us, again, we can do a lot of different things in Odyssey. I don't have to tell this community that, but I put this in because I'm presenting this to the HL7 community as well, where we can then create an evaluation report of these measure definitions in real world data that we're going to really try and standardize in templates such that, again, this information can be really valuable to the quality people. And I think Jared's going to allude to, talk a little bit about this too. So again, I'm not going to do that, but we're trying to, again, create these standardized processes and these outputs that will really help, rapid cycle this information around through in both defining, executing, and deploying back into the quality environment at some point in the future. So again, right now, this is still very proof of concept. So that the September Connectathon at HL7 in Phoenix, we're going to be doing what you see at the top of the screen there. It's going to be manual. We're essentially going to sort of take, data dQM definitions and create CIRSE criteria based on the dQM ELM constructs, sort of under the guise of a few experts like myself, kind of helping guide that through. But our goal is really to create rule-based engines to execute this transformation in a highly standardized way, so that we really ensure there's no loss of integrity from the FHIR specified definition when you redirect the CQL to pull from a different CDN than the original specification. So the idea is, we're going to do this manually now, but hopefully, eventually, we'll have the build capacity to do this automatically. So again, in summary, this is all very sort of proof of concept, and the idea is really is liked by a lot of people in the quality community because there's a real need to do this kind of evaluation. And I hope that at some point we'll be able to build this engine, so the seamless transition from FHIR CQL to OMOP CQL to executing in Odyssey, SQL rendered Odyssey compatible queries are defined to really help provide a powerful resource to both the measure developers, but also to the Odyssey community, because I think these cohort definitions as phenotypes in the Odyssey community can really help. We can populate these as tested and validated, and we can put the terms of use next to them and put them into the phenotype library, which I know Gautam is trying to build out. And again, by providing these evaluation report criteria next to those, we can give people in the Odyssey community hopefully a lot of information back to we don't want to draw all the data, the knowledge out of the Odyssey community to do our own needs. We want to produce some return on that investment, and really partner up to help improve what you might want to be doing, providing these validated quality constructs. So in conclusion, we've got a couple quality measures we're looking at. There's a few diabetes definitions we're going to be also adding to this, because we have these FHIR CQL specified cohort definitions. We've got a couple of domains we sort of lined up with the Odyssey, with the OMOP, tables and things. We'll can look at this in September. So if you're interested in this, I hope you can attend in September. I'm hopeful that at the Odyssey Symposium, under the OMOP on FHIR, we'll be able to discuss some of this and work through some of these things as well, with to that perspective. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to, I think, Clark, who's going to take you into a deep dive into CQL.
Ben, do you want questions at the end, or how does it work?
Yeah, either way. I mean, I don't know.
I have a question. I mean, obviously, the most of what you discussed here we already had internally at the FHIR OMOP meetings. The validation. So the CMS spends this ridiculous amount of money, or it is spent on behalf of the CMS. And obviously, if you can get these measures very wrong, if you count the wrong patients, how does it get validated to the degree that the CMS says, yep, that's the right thing?
Well,
how does it work?
I mean, I think that, yeah, so the process with CMS, why it was so expensive was because we were essentially creating a bespoke study CMS required us to test new measure concepts in at least 3 different installations of EMRs and other kinds of, actually mostly just with EMRs, which at that time was pretty impossible because, none of these EMRs, they were essentially transactional systems that were not oriented towards being able to produce these kind of results. And so what we ended up doing was spending months with back and forth with the vendors to try and say, okay, well, here's what we want. It was a lot of qualitative, not much quantitative, and we went in multiple cycles back and forth trying to calculate a result. And the results for many measures were not deemed good enough by CMS expectation. That left a lot of really good quality measure concepts on the cutting room floor because they just were not able to be validated to their expectations. So there's, CMS has published expectations for kind of what they expect to see in terms of reliability, validity, and scientific soundness, scientific acceptability under their criteria. But that was really hard in the the ECQM world when we were developing those because we couldn't do that. In the NCQA world, in HEDIS, we have a similar process where we again work with data holders. It's different data environments because we don't limit ourselves to just EMRs. But we have a whole team of data analysts who do that back and forth, and we have sort of scientific protocols, and we have these, like I said, these field test reports that we produce. It's all very manual. It's not highly standardized. Although in recent years, I've been using the OMOP CDM for all data dictionaries for our field tests, so that helps. But then again, none of our key stakeholders necessarily have stood up OMOP, so that was kind of one of the limiting factors. So that has changed now. So I'm hopeful that by standardizing both the queries we're asking by using OMOP as a data model, and also relying on some of the the evaluation, characterization, scientific packages that you already have, both from like DQD for the ETL to OMOP, but also just for the being able to run statistical analyses on that data in a highly standardized fashion, generate these reports. That's going to enable both the development of those new measures that people really want, but also just again to reduce a lot of that back and forth and let's try and patch this together so we can at least get something that's just good enough, which doesn't, to me as a researcher, really speak to like really effective, high quality measurement constructs that are published.
And I don't want to hold up much longer, but the reason I'm asking is we have the same problem, right? We have these cohorts and we want to get them right, and the data are not always perfect, so you use combination of data to get it. How would the CMS, when you say the CMS wasn't happy and rejected, how do they know that? How can they reject it? They're not like in these EHRs, are they? Or how does it work? How do they know what's the ground truth?
Well, I would assert that they don't. Right, so a lot of this work was done by contractors, who had analytics capabilities. But again, I think the solution to this, I can't speak to CMS, and all the problems they're in. But the solution here is really understanding that for quality, for like performance measurement, for quality measurement, you have to have data that is fit for use for that specific context, right? You can't rely on a fitness for use assessment of data quality for quality measurement that you might also say, well, that's also good for decision support, clinical decision support applications, because you probably have a different threshold. That's very complicated because the fitness for use is decreed by the end user, and the end users haven't done a really good job of saying, well, these are the parameters, these are the expectations we need. But I think that again, as we sort of evolve this over time, we're going to be able to really be much more specific in our fitness for use. So despite the fact that data is always going to be highly variable, we're going to have at least some threshold of it's good enough to do quality measurement because it exhibits these characteristics, and this is where where the DQD can provide us a lot of this information. Provides this has sufficient to at least do quality measurement validation in. And again, this is sort of where we're trying to work towards this common understanding of what we need for quality measurement and what may be some and those characteristics that you might need to do a network study that's more specific, oriented towards like a clinical decision support application, and that's fine. And I think if you started with a quality measurement definition and maybe expanded on that, that might give you a leg up as opposed to just trying to define it on your own from scratch, which is a lot harder to do. And also in for certain chronic diseases like diabetes, that can be extraordinarily complicated. because you don't know what other people are using or what other people are doing. So I'm hopeful that, by getting these dQM cohort definitions into the Odyssey repositories, that might give people a starting point to do their own work, understanding that it's, this was defined for quality measurement, not necessarily for, clinical decision support. But they can start there, and then they can build off of that, and they can, know that at least the core foundation of what they're building off of has some validity in some context.
Yeah.
But
I want to
it's
make
really
sure that
wild west right now, the
presentation.
quality measurement. I don't want to scare everyone off. Yeah, so let's keep going with the rest of the presentation, because I don't want to. I could talk about this all day.
Good.
And if you want to hear more,
Hello.
come to the OMOP on FHIR work group.
Hello, Craig, can you advance the slide? I think two more, one more. There you go, great.
Yep, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Oh, back up. Yeah, oh, you did the reveal here. When I was talking with Ben earlier today, forward one.
Okay.
There we go. When I was talking with Ben earlier and I was listening to it, what I heard was the idea that we would be taking CQL on FHIR and converting those into CIRSE queries. And that's a really nice approach. It's pragmatic, it'll work, and it's great. But what I wanted to talk today is a little bit more ambitious and something that might really benefit our community. And right now we have two primary ways of querying the data. Either we write SQL or we create a cohort definition with CIRSE. And there's nothing really in the middle, a high-level language that can do some very flexible things. CIRSE has many limitations. And as soon as you drop down to SQL, you're in a world of hurt. So there's ways to, the CQL clinical quality language provides a way of looking at a database and thinking of it as an intermediate, something that could be just as good as CIRSE, but nowhere near as burdensome as SQL. And if you look at the definitions of what it is, it's really a mature domain-specific language for clinical operators. And what it does for CIRSE is quite a few things. CIRSE does not have time resolution intervals, but the clinical quality language does have interval arithmetic and interval collapsing, which is the CIRSE magic that makes the whole last step of a cohort definition work. CQL supports all kinds of concept data type as a native object that you can throw around, which is real important for our domain. And it has it has a way to provide custom operators. And so there's a lot there, including things like, I just wanted to give one example. Taking the blood pressure increase of 5 millimeters within a 20-minute interval, that's not particularly challenging at all with the clinical quality language. That's not possible with CIRSE. And it's pretty hard to drop down to CQL or SQL just to get that kind of result. So an observation with clinical quality language is that it's not limited to FHIR. It's not limited to the quality data model. And Craig, if you could change the slide for me. We could just use CQL, the clinical quality language, directly on top of OMOP. And you could think of this as an alternative to CIRSE. And so SQL or CQL is a standard, and it could be used directly on OMOP. We don't have to be going from FHIR CQL and convert it to CIRSE. We could actually write measures directly in the clinical quality language using OMOP as the target data model. So there would be no need to build and support our own standard documentation. The clinical quality language supports everything that CIRSE does and a whole lot more. We could do a back trip, so all the CIRSE definitions could be converted into a CQL/OMOP. And this would allow us to have a long transition period of several years where both of them can work. And we could slowly, for example, deprecate CIRSE and start using clinical quality language. The clinical quality language has a human readable syntax. One nice thing about it is that you can have inline comments, that really document a particularly challenging aspect of a cohort definition that's useful to you. And of course, the clinical quality language addresses many deficiencies that CIRSE struggles with, such as getting down to the time resolution, window functions, and all things like, and even simple things like just returning the list of matches on something that's not a cohort. For example, getting back to the observations that might be matched. So the way this could work is that the CQL logic could be done as a push down. So you have an interpreter that converts CQL into SQL. And we've been working on some tools that would help this, but there's a lot of work. But this is really in our reach. We could do this. This would not be a huge lift. It would take work, but it would change the way we could look at how we could query OMOP. Next slide, Craig, if you don't mind. I want to say that there's not a panacea. If we did something like this, if we had a clinical quality language implementation for OMOP, you couldn't just grab an existing CQL out there and just plop it in and expect it to work, because the data model is different. Those would be the FHIR-based data model or the quality data model, but they're not the OMOP data model. So that means that you would still have to rewrite them. Maybe some of it could be automated, but you probably need someone to look it over and make sure that it's correct. There is a mismatch between, one type of object can convert into several types of one type of FHIR might be in two different tables in OMOP or vice versa. The existing clinical quality language measures out there don't use the OMOP standard vocabularies, and we would probably want to be doing that. So finally, there's one issue with some of the quality measures, and that is that the clinical quality language in QDM uses negated events, and QI core added negated events in order to support these, but OMOP doesn't have negated events, and I don't know if that's a thing that we want to do or not want to do, and Ben could probably speak to this because I'm ignorant of the whole issue, but it's one of the important aspects. And finally, one opportunity is that we could, with some really nice gymnastics, integrate some of the Odyssey methods in with a CQL interface, to where you could have parts of the data set being shoved over to an R program or Cyclops to do some analysis, and then brought back as a table, and then continue in clinical quality language land. But creating a gateway to invoke these R methods will be work. And anyway, so that's a different way of thinking about this. Just to rewind, Ben was talking about how we can convert existing clinical quality language things on FHIR or in the quality data model into CIRSE. And I'm suggesting that we could just adopt clinical quality language, and then really we could have the quality groups take work from us, and we could develop our measures directly upon Odyssey, and then perhaps push them back, or make the back and forth a lot easier. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it. Jared might be next, I think. Sorry.
I guess there are probably some questions, maybe, or I don't know if you want to field any questions before I get started.
Clark, is there an application on the CQL on OMOP? Well, because it's fairly theoretical, right? But if there was like an example where people tried that out and compared and got some experience, is there anything like that?
We don't have anything like that yet, Christian, but I think we should implement something like that to where people could get a feel for it. I would love to write a grant for it, and getting your guys' support would be lovely.
Cool.
And there was one demonstration project that did it. It was very limited, but again, I think that's it was just one. So.
All right, Jared, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll just open the end to questions to anybody.
Perfect. All right. So before I dive in here, just a very brief introduction. So I'm Jared Houghtaling. I have a background in biomedical engineering, and I worked for 3 years for a company called Eden's Health, based in Belgium, as a data scientist. And in that work, I did led a lot of harmonization efforts, both within Europe and outside of Europe. And one of those efforts was this LAISDAR project, which is an attempt to create kind of a national federated network of OMOP instances around Rwanda. This project started in 2021, or really got underway in 2021, and was a collaboration between Ghent University in Belgium, the University of Rwanda, the Biomedical Center in Rwanda, as well as the Ministry of Health in Rwanda, and then the Eden's Health company. The initial goal or proposed goal of the project was to look at COVID response and public health response to COVID across the country, and has since largely grown into other relevant disease areas and topics of interest. And so what I'll do is I'm going to give a very brief overview of what the project did, and then it'll become clear that reporting, and specifically reporting on quality measures, became an unexpectedly important aspect of this implementation. And I'll kind of talk toward what we did in that regard, and then maybe how that can be expanded to other projects. Maybe next slide. Okay, so technically, very brief overview. We ended up with 14 hospitals and clinical, or let's say community clinics. So we had really a broad range of sites that wanted to participate in this. We took Mac mini machines and actually set them up with essentially the Odyssey ecosystem. So we installed Docker and various Docker services to support things like the ETL, but also Atlas, our studio with the Hades packages, quality checks through Achilles and data quality dashboard. We created then this reporting platform that I'll get into in a second, as well as then an Arachne integration to kind of enable some of this more federated study validation and federated research. In addition to those 14 sites, Rwanda collected, or currently still collects, COVID information at a federal level, so on the level of national government, things like particular surveys and responses to public health implementation, but also then vaccines and cases of COVID. From our side, we then used a program called Simple MDM, which is multi-device management, to orchestrate some of the processes. So especially the ETL and the quality control processes, we can actually deploy on a schedule, automated, using this tool. And then I want to emphasize that each of these hospital, or each of these, let's say, data sites has their own kind of Odyssey instance to explore the OMOP data. All right, so maybe next slide. Yeah, and so then that's the reporting application bit. All right, so in terms of the reports, what we were given was a set of example reports that these hospitals have to produce and send to the Ministry of Health each month. And this is just an example of one of the tables from that report, but this is on HIV and specifically HIV in infants that have been associated with the given hospital. And so what we did is we took these reports and we actually created cohort definitions for each of the various measures of interest. And so we did that using Atlas, and actually we built an Atlas version that has support for Kinyarwanda, so the local language in Rwanda, that then sites could also interact with and use and help define and develop these cohort definitions. So again, we're starting with the reports that these are being filled out by hand manually. They're really going through their EHR data, sometimes paper data, and plugging in all this information, and then producing and submitting these reports. And what we ended up doing is we took the OMOP data that we had converted at each of these sites, and we created a reporting R package. We used some of Peter Rainbeck's work on the CDM inspection report package to stitch together Word documents based on SQL queries and also generations of cohorts using these cohort definitions that are also then available in Atlas. Next slide, which is, I think, another just example of one of the tables that we produce. And you can see these are cohorts that, again, related to HIV, but looking at HIV patients coming in, which ones are on ARTs, these antiretroviral therapies, but also looking at other relevant counts and stratifications across age and gender, things like this. So lots of different reports, and this is of course ongoing work. If you go to the next slide. So as of now, or I guess as of last month, I should say, there are now 4 sites that are actively using this reporting tool that are trying to update and modify it. I should also say that once sites realized that this was possible, that they could actually use OMOP data and use this information to produce monthly reports with cohorts of interest, it was a huge motivating factor for them to start becoming involved in the project. And it really gave kind of a tangible impact in terms of that we can use OMOP data for this. This is an exciting thing. And then in general, so what's shown on the right here is actually the feedback loop that we implemented for kind of the ETL and the quality control aspects. And what we saw is once we started to produce reports at these sites, that they started to really interact with this kind of feedback process and look at, okay, how can we update mappings? We're seeing that only half of our tables can now be produced because we're missing mappings for some of the other data necessary for these cohort generations. How can we actually augment and update and help with the mappings and things like that? So that's been very cool to see, and to kind of watch this process evolve and this kind of feedback loop work effectively. Maybe just we can finish it off here. Go to the next slide. I guess then the key takeaways for me from this is, and I think Ben has alluded to this as well as Clark, but OMOP does have potential to serve a pretty substantial purpose within this dQM space, and especially I think as we've seen with Rwanda, to do so in low and middle income countries. It also, yeah, I already mentioned in terms of the motivating factor, but in terms of getting sites to be involved and participating, it was by far the biggest thing that we could offer them. This ability to create these reports and to kind of better understand their monthly patient interactions and quality metrics in that regard. And then I think lastly, everything that's been produced for this, or the LAISDAR team, I should say, is looking to make this available to the Odyssey community and other efforts, both within Africa and outside of Africa, to take advantage of using OMOP for understanding essentially quality metrics at a given site. So that's a very brief overview, but I'm happy to field any questions on that. Thanks very much for listening.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for the presentation. Let's go some questions. Andy.
Hey, I just wanted to add a little gloss to this because the LAISDAR project is something that the Africa Working Group is super, super excited about. And I think it has real relevance to the work that Ben is doing on the quality measure side. And I wanted to give a little context, which was, you know, there's this effort within sort of international global health, like PEPFAR, the Global Fund for AIDS and HIV, for TB, malaria, to shift the responsibility for the data collection and reporting to the countries themselves, as opposed to separate infrastructures. So there's this sort of macroeconomic thing going on, which is actually saying, can countries utilize their infrastructure to do quality measure reporting in addition to operational care? And for us, potentially adding on research, right, to be able to do network studies now, to be, you know, finally participate. It's a similar sort of dynamic, you know, that I think that Paul has been talking about a lot, which is, you know, there is a real macroeconomic reason here where if we could solve this problem in the United States or countries that, you know, need to do these quality reporting, that there's going to be a lot of reuse of this technology. So I just think this has been a hugely positive move that we've seen, and if can be done in Rwanda. Obviously, Rwanda is a little bit of a special case in Africa, but I think it's definitely something we can reproduce globally.
Well, and I thank you for that, because again, this is something that we actually see very much in the States of the Medicaid reporting, right? The Medicaid core sets and these kind of reporting. Jared's presentation was directly applicable in my mind to what we see in the Medicaid issues, right? State by state. And so, yeah, again, this is just something that's desperately needed, both here in the U.S. and abroad.
Andrew, go ahead.
Great talks. If it's all right, can I share my screen a little bit? I want to just show something that can underline, I think, the really tremendous potential to impact health that this work has. I think it's implicit in what was said, but what people who aren't deeply involved in this world may not understand is that, you know, rather than doing a significant publication and hoping that dissemination of those results changes people's minds and how they deliver care and so on, this is work that is used in the act of delivering care and in designing care for large populations. And the ability to refine these algorithms for defining populations and to use those definitions and analyses that really very directly speak to which care quality measures impact results in ways that are reliable is a unique opportunity that Odyssey has to step up everything that's done in this space, from a reporting framework where you're obligated to report to a planning framework where you're actively using these measures to design care and to deliver it. And we did a lot of work on this in Kaiser. A result of which is shown here, where we developed with Greg Paulson and other folks at NCQA various quality measures, and then we related them in appropriately statistically adjusted models to the outcomes in myocardial infarction, stroke, congestive heart failure. These are person time measures that are looking at control of diastolic and systolic blood pressure, serum lipids, hemoglobin A1C, and so forth. And these numbers here represent the change in the incidence of these outcomes per 1,000 patients for a 10% increase in these quality measures. And it gives you a sense of which of these things are paying off in the populations. I don't want to steal any more time than that, but I think it's really worth emphasizing that this is almost a unique space in which the Odyssey community's work can vary. You don't have to wait for people to take this stuff up. You are directly intervening in the intervention and the care design process in a way that really should be emphasized, and that's why I'm emphasizing it. But that was a great set of talks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions? I know there's a lot in the chat right now. Even when this call ends, the chat will stay up so people can go back. Hayden, go ahead.
Hey, I was wondering, this is fascinating because this is stuff that I think I've definitely had come up before, where if this tooling was available, if this kind of approach was kind of in front of me, I would have said my job's done and probably saved myself a year or two. Have you, has any work been done with like patient safety measures? I know we had mentioned HEDIS, I think that was in the prior presentation, but this seems like something that could be applied to patient safety in a lot of ways as well. I'm just wondering if you came upon that or considered any measurements that are similar.
Well, I mean, again, I think this is a very formative idea in terms of the intersection between these two standards and how you would use each one and what the definitions are. I think measures are measures. I mean, you have these measure definitions that are objective and highly standardized, and you can deploy those. But the tooling to go back and forth still it doesn't exist. It requires these various people with very specific expertise to manually interpret and then sort of reconfigure to work, which is possible. It's just not ideal. And so again, I hope that everyone will continue these conversations and come to the symposium in October, and let's keep hashing this out about what measures are high priority. What would you like to see as use cases in this pilot that we can prioritize, and the harder the better. Give us the complex stuff to solve, because if we can do that, we can do all the easy stuff with no problem. So we really want to test the edges of this one. We don't want to just kind of do a basic proof of concept that only gives a quarter of the community something useful. We want to really provide this for quality measurement at large.
Yeah, another bit was that I really liked was just the use of the tech. I mean, Mac Mini and there's a lot of these that kind of have been coming to market more and more because those smaller form computers have been kind of at that stage of enterprises being able to offload them. And I'm wondering if you have tested it in other hardware or have like recommended hardware. What comes to mind is like ThinkCenter, and I think Optiplex and HP has a line as well.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think in the beginning, the Mac Mini was just chosen as a very simple and robust way to deploy Docker services effectively in a small format that we could, have replicated. But I think there's many other options that could very easily serve a similar purpose. I think our biggest constraint here was that we could not use cloud-based computing. That was not allowed within the Rwanda Ministry of Health. So we needed to have really a physical machine on site, and the Mac Mini fit that bill, at least at the time that we chose it. So